Good morning, gamers, and welcome back to another episode of the Beginner's Guide series, where I teach you just about everything you could possibly want to know about Valheim. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into every single weapon offered in the game, but before we get started, make sure you're subscribed and turn on that notification bell so you know every time a new video goes live. Let's get into it. Okay, welcome to my weapons warehouse. We're going to start off with going over all of the arrows. There are currently 11 different arrows in the game, ranging from every single biome, but we start with the classic wood arrow that only does 22 piercing damage. Then is the fire arrow that does only 11 piercing damage, but does 22 fire damage. Then we've got the flint head arrow that does 27, bronze head that does 32, iron head 42, so we get up a little bit more. We have our first elemental arrow, the poison arrow that does 28 pierce, but 52 points of poison damage. And the base is the obsidian arrow that does 52 piercing damage. Next is the silver arrow that does the same 52 piercing damage but does an additional 20 spirit damage. Then is the frost arrow that does 26 piercing but does the 52 frost damage. And all of those ones do 10 knockback. These last two do 15. So we've got the needle arrow from the plains that does 62 piercing damage. And lastly, we have the new carapace arrow that does 72 points of piercing damage. Definitely it depends on what your enemy that you're facing, depends on which arrow you're going to want to choose, but the new carapace arrows are honestly very solid. With the addition of ballistas and crossbows into the game, we now have two new projectiles, the bolts and the missiles. So first we've got the bone bolt that does 32 piercing damage, and the iron bolt that does 42, jumping up to the black metal bolt that does 62 points of piercing damage, and lastly is the carapace bolt that does 72. So if you notice, the carapace bolt and the carapace arrow both do the same amount of piercing damage, but with the addition of the turrets that you can build, we have missiles, which I think is just so cool. Currently we only have two available. The wooden missile that does 75 piercing damage, and the black metal missile that does 120. I think that is crazy, but once you're in the Mistlands, you honestly need every point of damage that you can get. And I don't know if I have mentioned this before, but we have a bomb that we got in the swamps, but we also now have a bomb that you can get in the Mistlands. So the first one is the ooze bomb that does 5 blunt damage, but then does 40 poison damage. And then the bile bomb, which I think is disgusting, but really, really effective, does that same 5 blunt damage, but it does 15 to 30 fire and poison damage, so that one packs way more of a punch. We now have 8 different axes in the game, starting with the stone axe that does 15 to 30 slashing damage, and that depends on what level the axe is at. 15 if it's a regular stone axe, and then if it's upgraded to level 4, it does the 30 points, so just keep that in mind as I go through the rest of these. Then is the flint axe that does 20 to 35, bronze that does 40 to 55, iron that does 60 to 75, and the black metal axe that does 100 to 115 points of slashing damage. But now we actually have a new single-handed axe. Is called the Jotunbane, and it does 80 to 95 points of slashing damage. And we still have two two-handed axes the Battle Axe that does 70 to 88 points, and the Crystal Battle Axe, one of my personal favorite weapons, does 90 to 108 points of slashing damage. But do you like this new axe? Have you replaced it into your regular gameplay? I don't know about you, but when I saw the concept art for the new bow we were getting with the Mistlands, I was so excited. But before we get there, let's take a look back at all of the previous bows that we currently have, starting with the classic crude bow that does 22 to 31 points of piercing damage, the classic finewood bow that does 32 to 41, huntsman that does 42 to 51, Draugr Fang 47 to 56, and then we have the Spine Snap that does 72 to 84 points of piercing damage, and additionally does 5 to 20 points of spirit damage as well. I absolutely love this weapon. I think the red glow is just gorgeous and also terrifying. But with the Mistlands, we also got added a crossbow, the Arbalest, which does 200 to 209 points of piercing damage. And then in the background there, I just put the ballista because it is massive and just so cool to look at. What an amazing addition to the game. If you don't know how to use the ballista, you actually can use a trophy on the ballista and it will auto shoot at those enemies. I found it doesn't work super well, like when I'm being attacked by Yalls, but it is still a super cool feature that they added in. Next up are the clubs offered, starting with the Wood Club that does 12 to 30 points of blunt damage. Again, that range is depending on its upgrade level. Then is the Stag Breaker, which does the area of effect blast kind of to it, does 20 to 38 points. The Bronze Mace does 35 to 53. Iron Mace 55 to 73, and then the Iron Sledge there does 55 to 73, but has a significant higher knockback than just the regular mace. And then this one's kind of split. So we have the Porcupine that does 45 to 63 piercing damage and 50 blunt damage. Pretty cool, but personally I prefer the Frostner, which does 35 blunt damage, but does 40 to 58 frost damage and 20 spirit damage. I think it is more of a rounded weapon. I think you can use it in almost every biome. I love it more than Porcupine, but let me know your thoughts. Which would you like better? Let me know in the comments down below. And our new, just massive area of effect weapon is the Demolisher. Honestly, a perfect name for this thing because it does 145 to 163 blunt damage. Like, what even? That's just crazy to me. Moving on to our knives, and starting with the butcher knife, just because it's a little bit different, because it doesn't hurt regular enemies. You use it on your tamed animals. It technically does 1,000 points of piercing damage, but that's just because it wants to instantly kill whatever tamed animal you hit it with. So starting off with our real kind of weapons is the flint knife that only does 5 to 8 points of both piercing and slashing damage. Then we've got the Abyssal Razor, which does 20 to 23 points of piercing and slashing. The Copper Knife that does 12 to 15. The Silver Knife that does 25 to 28. The Black Metal Knife that does 34 to 37. And then finally we have the new knives that they added, and I say knives because it is two-piece, is the Skull and Hattie, I want to say is how you pronounce it, that does 45 to 48 piercing and slashing damage. And they also have the Flesh Rippers back there, because I don't know what you would count them under, if they're knife or fists. I am not really 100% sure. But they do 60 to 75 points of slashing damage. And then I have the trap back there just because I thought it was funny. Polearms are one of my favorite weapons to use because it allows you to have distance with your enemy while still being able to get in really good hits, starting with the bronze Atgear that does 45 to 63 points of piercing damage, the iron Atgear that does 65 to 83, black metal 105 to 123, and our new polearm is the Himinful. I actually have no idea how to pronounce that, so very sorry. That does only 80 points of piercing damage, but then does 40 to 58 points of lightning damage. I think that is so cool that we now have lightning powers in the Mistlands. So cool. We actually have a lot of variety when it comes to different shields that you can use in the game. So the difference between the small circular shields and the long rectangular shields, which are tower shields, is that you are able to parry with the smaller ones. So that means if you block it and the enemy hits you, that they will be staggered for a short amount of time and you can get in an extra hit, which I prefer. With the tower shields, you take way less damage when getting hit, but I find that they slow you down way too much to make them as useful. If I could pick one to use, it would honestly be the bone shield, just because when you're going through dungeons, they're a nice thing to have at that point in the game. Later on in the game, I haven't found as much of a use for them, but it is all personal preference. So starting off with the wood shield, that does 6 to 18 block force, and that range again is on the level of upgrades that it has. And the wood tower, 10 to 22, bone tower, 32 to 44, the bronze buckler, 16 to 28, iron buckler, 28 to 40. The bandage shield is the wood one with the iron around it, has 42 to 54. The tower version has 52 to 64. The silver shield does 60 to 72, which is the same as the serpent shield. And then in the plains, we have the black metal shield that does 78 to 90, and the tower version that does 104 to 116. And then we've got the new ones with the Mistlands, which honestly, if you fought in the Mistlands, you know how important having a shield can be. So we've got the buckler that does 78 to 84, and the tower that does 96 to 102. That seriously blocks you, but you need it against those massive bug guys. Moving on to spears, these are personally not my favorite weapon to use in the game. I find that aiming them is very difficult and I can never throw them well enough to make it useful, so I don't use these very often, but maybe they're your favorite, so I'll give you the stats anyway. Starting with the flint spear, we've got 20 to 38 points of piercing damage. Bronze does 35 to 53, Ancient Bark 55 to 73, the Fang Spear does 75 to 93, and the new one is the Carapace Spear that does 115 to 133 points of piercing damage. I also do have the Abyssal Harpoon that technically only does 10 points of piercing damage, but it does stick to your enemy that you are shooting at, including your friends. So it has a more of a tool purpose than a weapon. My go-to weapon is usually a sword. I just love them so much. The bronze sword does 35 to 53 points of slashing damage. Iron, 55 to 73. Silver does 75 to 93 points of slashing damage and an additional 30 points of spirit damage. Really great for killing those undead. The black metal sword does 95 to 113, and we have two new swords. First is the Mistwalker, the one that is glowing, which is just so cool when you're in the Mistlands. It looks amazing. That does only 75 points of slashing damage, but then does 40 to 58 frost damage and an additional 15 points of spirit damage. Lastly, we have the two-handed sword, the Crom, that does 150 to 168 points of slashing damage. It is a beast to play with. Lastly is our magic items that were added with the Mistlands, and they're not necessarily weapons per se, but I did want to go over a couple of their stats. I will be making a magic beginner's guide pretty soon here, so stay tuned for that, but I just wanted to, give you a little taste of what we've got here. So first is the Staff of Embers that does 120 points of blunt damage and 120 to 138 fire damage. The Staff of Frost does 30 to 36 points of frost damage. And then these last two aren't necessarily weapons. We've got the Staff of Protection, which when casts, it creates a dome of protection around you that your enemies have to break through before they can get to you. Very useful when you're in fights, especially with the Queen. And lastly is the Dead Razor. I'm going to go into more detail later on that, but for now, just know that it literally raises an army of the dead. So cool. And that is every single weapon in Valheim currently up to the Mistlands update. We'll see with the Ashlands. I know we're going to get cool new fiery swords. I can just feel it. Let me know your favorite weapon in the comments down below. If I missed any, please let me know. I absolutely want to provide the most accurate information out there. I appreciate you. If you stayed to the end and you like this video, let me know by leaving a like, and I will catch you next time on the Beginner's Guide. Bye!